Hello Year 13, welcome to our English mock exam warm-up. In this video, which I would of course encourage you to return to on the morning of each of your exam papers, I'll remind you of the specification requirements for each of the papers. We're going to go through some model paragraphs for each, and I'm going to give you some pointers for further warm-up revision that you could do. The most important thing is that by the end of this video, you will be raring to go to get into that exam hall and to give it your best shot. So let's begin with Othello. The whole exam paper is 2 hours and 15 minutes, so probably you're going to want to spend about an hour and 10 on the Othello question. You'll spend slightly longer on Othello than Streetcar because there are 4 assessment objectives. Just a quick reminder, that's AO1, you've got to talk about the writer's message. AO2, you've got to refer to the techniques Shakespeare uses, in particular those dramatic, tragic techniques. AO3, you've got to talk about the context of both Jacobean England and the Venice that Othello is set in. And AO5, worth a disproportionately large amount of the marks, and therefore one that you will really focus on, get your critics in there, disagree with some, agree with others. This person was answering a question on reputation in Othello, and their paragraph goes, "Furthermore, Shakespeare presents reputation to be vulnerable to change and manipulation. Shakespeare's initial setting of Othello in Venice, which was viewed as a civilized, cohesive and liberal society, allows the characters to demonstrate their respective reputation, which for Othello is through his poetic and admirable speech. Greeting the Duke and Senators as most potent, grave and reverend signors, suggesting that his fluency is directly linked to his much respected reputation. However, the transition from Venice to Cyprus is significant to the tragic ending of the play, with Cyprus being an isolated island that is vulnerable to attack by the Ottoman Empire, which in fact they conquered. Shakespeare uses this setting for dramatic purposes to highlight Othello's own vulnerability to destruction and insecurities, which inevitably lead to the hamartia and consequently to the cathartic response from the audience. Carol Phillips argues that Othello's tragedy begins when he forgets that he is black. Although discrimination, which is often found in the otherness of an individual, lumba, plays a significant role, it is rather Othello's propensity to jealousy, F.R. Leavis, which enables Iago to trigger the decline of Othello's reputation by directly torturing Othello and Desdemona's marriage, through the insinuations of Desdemona having an affair with Cassio. And on it goes. Now I suggest you pause this video and reflect for a moment what makes this paragraph especially good considering the assessment criteria for Othello. Here's what I think. The first thing I would draw out is that this argument is based on the specific context of the fact that we have Venice as a liberal society and Cyprus as threatened by the Ottoman Empire. The argument about reputation, at first seemingly unconnected, but later proven to be deeply connected to this context. Next up, this is really important in all of your essays, make sure that your quotations are well embedded and that they're part of the argument, not just a bolt-on. Thirdly, this person doesn't just focus on the adjective that Shakespeare uses or the simile that Shakespeare uses. They analyse the tragic and dramatic features. They've looked at hamartia, they've looked at the tragic ending of the play, and you know a range of tragic features that you could similarly analyse. Finally, if you look at the bit I've highlighted in pink here, you can see that this person has balanced their critics. They've had Lumba face off with Leavis, and they claim that ultimately it's Leavis's argument about the propensity to jealousy that is perhaps most relevant. So, on top of that, have a think about these ingredients for a successful Othello essay. These are the 8 things you should really try to do in your Othello essay, particularly if you're about to go into that exam. Number 1, argue against a specific critical point of view. Have a go at Lumba's argument. Say that Leavis is wrong. Base your argument on a specific contextual point, like we saw in the example. Analyse the tragic features, again, was in the example. And analyse Shakespeare's dramatic techniques, for example, soliloquies. How does he use them? Compare the characters, particularly when they're speaking in iambic pentameter, and those characters who speak in prose. Number 6, compare Othello's presentation with the way that other black characters, such as Aaron in Titus Andronicus, are presented. Explore Iago's characterization as an echo of the 15th century Italian politician Machiavelli and his book, The Prince. And finally, analyse Desdemona as a disjointed sequence of positions, as Sinfield tells us. Do all of those things, or a good majority of them, and you are well on your way to writing a really good essay. Okay, on to section B of the drama paper, where you will be looking at Streetcar Named Desire. And of course for this, there are 3 assessment objectives: the writer's message, his techniques, and ultimately the context that inspired the play. There are lots of crossovers between Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams, particularly in the way that you can write about them and the skills that you need to demonstrate as you do. So as I read you this example paragraph from another student's work, this person who received an A star in the exam, make sure you're thinking of how you can be efficient, revising the same skills for both sections of this paper. Williams carefully cultivates Stanley's masculine, should have an E on the end, but they got an A star, so we'll forgive them, image throughout the play, creating a character who is the epitome of society's expectations of a man and masculinity. From his first moment on stage, Stanley has exaggerated masculine presence that at times almost seems something of how satirically he is presented. Williams has the first action in the play be heaving the package to Stella. That's the package of meat, of course. This is the first and primary evidence the audience has of Stanley's brute, animalistic and primitive nature, as he heaves, a rough yet powerful verb, a bloody package at Stella, who is something and gentle in comparison. This continues into his first interaction with Blanche, where he asks, "Can I take my shirt off?" And the stage directions read, he proceeds to remove his shirt. On top of this being foreshadowing of the harrowing conclusion of the story, it shows Stanley's complete disregard for a female's, should have an apostrophe, decency, or more importantly, her consent as he removes his shirt, exposes himself to her, and creates an image of a proud yet primitive character whose masculinity will surely prove to be degrading. First skill that I'd like you to focus on in this person's writing is the fact that they've talked about Williams's characters not as real people, but the characterization as a technique. This paragraph also has the same skill as the Shakespeare. It analyses the dramatic features. It also is really powerful in its analysis of structure, making links between scenes and the rest of the play. And finally, it makes links between the theme given, masculinity, and the tragic end of the play. Now, I don't need to read these ingredients out for you. I suggest that you pause and have a read of the 6 things that I think you absolutely must make a point of including in your Streetcar Named Desire essays when you go and write them today. So that's paper 1. Of course, at this point, you could pause the video, go and do your exam paper, and then you might want to return to the section I'm about to move on to, the prose paper, the morning of that exam. If so, I'll see you then. Otherwise, you might want to stick with me now and we'll go through prose and then the poems of the decade aspect of the poetry paper. You well know by now that prose, you are comparing Handmaid's Tale and Frankenstein, and as such there are 4 assessment objectives: writer's message, their choices of technique, language, structural, formal, the context that inspired both writers, and then, all importantly, you are comparing the 2, AO4. Okay, over to you. Ask yourselves, what makes a successful paragraph for Frankenstein and Handmaid's Tale? You've been studying the 2 texts since autumn. You should now have a very good sense of what I'm about to tell you this paragraph does well. The first thing is that at the beginning of the paragraph there is clear signposting of the comparison. This is what is the key difference. Next key feature. The contextual points are specific. They're not generalized. It's not about how people lost their faith in religion. It's much more specifically about how these two texts are inspired by their respective contexts. Each paragraph must start and finish with a comparison. And like this person has done, you must analyse the formal features of a novel. It's not a poem, it's not a play, so what features make it distinctly a novel? So, ingredients for a successful prose essay. Construct your argument around one of the key concepts that we've discussed in class. That might be dystopian or science fiction, perhaps the Freudian psyche, or maybe even Locke's tabula rasa. Compare the formal techniques used by each author. As I've just said, that paragraph did well. Think about the question, are these typical examples of the genre of the novel? Is it a typical science fiction? Is it what you would expect from dystopia? Explain how the characters change from the beginning to the middle and finally at the end. It's the easiest marks to get for structural analysis. Use more than one piece of evidence per paragraph, 2 quotes per text at least. To what extent can the narrators of the two novels be considered reliable? And what kind of feminists are the two writers? We're going to move on to paper 3 now, the poetry, and just advance warning. I'm only going to cover the poems of the decade example paragraph in this video because I've got a whole separate video to help you revise the romantics and how to structure a really effective romantics essay. So if that's what you're looking for, you might want to have a look at that video directly instead. Otherwise, we'll now go through poems of the decade and the specification for romantics. First part of the poetry paper is Poems of the Decade, and there are 3 assessment objectives, AO1, 2 and 4, and I would hope by this point in the video you are well acquainted with what they are. And then the big thing to remember with the romantics, the second half of the poetry exam, is that you do not get any marks for comparison. You might choose to structure your essay as a comparison just because it's the way you write and it's the easiest way to talk about 2 poems. But you don't need to. Instead, you must get the context in there. Okay, let's have a look at this example paragraph together for the Poems of the Decade paper. You might begin with a thesis statement that looks quite a lot like this. This is a successful one. Both Copus and Dunmore explore how identity is formed through childhood memory. The links between the childhood memory and adult self are made explicit by Dunmore through a narrative voice using first person and second person, while the third-person narrative of Copus's poem creates a greater sense of distance from the child self. And then we go into an extract from the 3rd paragraph of this person's essay. Although Dunmore's poem appears to be exploring a sense of distance between her adult and child self, the truth is we have nothing in common. Look how beautifully embedded that quote is. She also expresses a deep involvement with the thoughts and experience of the child she is addressing through detailed imagery. A baby vole or a bag of sherbet lemons, a wasp trap, and a den by the cesspit. That quote's not quite so well embedded, but the previous one was great, wasn't it? She repeatedly tries to bid farewell to her child self. I won't keep you then, I shan't cloud your morning, but keeps returning back with more reminiscence, ending with the vivid and unusual description of the little girl enjoying the taste of a scab. Copus's memory is equally vivid and detailed, but the link between the adult self and childhood memory is only implied. Indeed, the adult presence in the poem is distant and unattractive. The flush-faced secretary and the workers in the drab factory contrast with the allure of the friend with her shimmering oyster toenails. Now, as you can see, the thesis statement begins with a specific similarity focused on answering the question. And it then moves in the second sentence of the thesis statement to the specific difference, the thing that makes these 2 different poems rather than the same poem twice. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but that really is what this comparison essay is about. How are these 2 poems different? Then when we go into the main body paragraph, you can see that this person has provided alternative readings, different interpretations. They've analysed larger, we might say, recurring images, motifs, and semantic fields. They've not bothered talking about a little simile that doesn't have any indication of what the writers were actually doing. And finally, they've used the poems to bounce off each other. In other words, to say, by looking at this poem in light of the first poem, we can see that it's really about X, Y, Z. So there we are. Those are my top tips for how to write the very best essays in all 3 of your exam papers. If you're about to go into an exam, good luck.